Our Bibles are open to Matthew chapter 6 tonight, but we are now moving to a new section of study within the Sermon on the Mount. Now, we typically begin each week's lesson with a review. By the time we complete our study of the Sermon on the Mount, I want us to have, my goal is for us to have a working knowledge of the 111 verses that make up Matthew chapters 5, 6, and 7. Back to Matthew chapter 6, verse 1. Jesus said, "Be careful not to practice your righteousness in front of others to be seen by them. If you do, you will have no reward from your Father in heaven." Jesus said that religious leaders gave to be seen, prayed to be heard, and fasted so that it was obvious to others how spiritual, how righteous they were. However, Jesus said, because they had done these things to be seen by men, they received their reward in full. That's the first 18 verses of Matthew chapter 6. So that brings us to verse 19 tonight. Now, Matthew chapter 6, verses 19 through the end of the chapter, Jesus addressed two major topics. Our section of study tonight, verses 19 through 24, Jesus talked about how we handle luxuries of life. And then in a couple of weeks, we'll move to verses 25 through 34, where Jesus addressed how to handle and how to approach necessities of life. A key word in that study, I'll go ahead and tell you, is worry. Jesus talked about not worrying 5 times in that section. So we move to our text for our study tonight, Matthew chapter 6, verses 19 through 24. "Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and vermin destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where moths and vermin do not destroy, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. The eye is the lamp of the body. If your eyes are healthy, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eyes are unhealthy, your whole body will be full of darkness. If then the light within you is darkness, how great is that darkness? No one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money." I want us to go straight to verse 21. I believe this short verse, it really is the heart of the matter here. The big question is simple. Where is our heart? Because Jesus said wherever our heart is, it's where our treasure is. When Jesus talked about our heart, now what exactly was he talking about? So this is the general idea. We're talking about where we invest our lives, our motives, our attitudes, our thought patterns. And Jesus said, for where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. On what do we concentrate our efforts? What do we spend our time thinking about? What about most of our energy? It's spent toward what end, toward what goal? Now, some of the answers we might talk about include where we live, our house, how we get there, transportation, what we wear, our clothing, how we pay our bills, our money. We may not think about these things all the time. I'm quickly acknowledging that. But this passage challenges us to make sure that we don't have an unhealthy obsession with such things. Because in our society today, there is a constant tendency to want something newer, bigger, and better than before. Now, there's several problems with our obsession with things. And Jesus talked about one of those in this passage. He says these things, they wear out, they break down, they give out. They can be stolen. They might be lost. One storm or one fire, everything that we have amassed can be reduced to a pile of rubble. Now, there is another problem with things I think should go without saying, but we need to make sure we say it. We cannot take it with us. I have looked through folders that I keep. It contains dozens of funeral sermons that I have preached over the years. I'm reminded that someday we will all die. And everything for which we have worked will remain on earth. Everything. We cannot take those things with us. We will leave it all behind. Jesus said back in Matthew chapter 5, verse 20, that our righteousness should surpass that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. And over the past few months, we've been working with this definition of righteousness, right standing before God and right living before mankind. Religious leaders didn't do either one very well. Their teachings were inadequate and incomplete. That's Matthew chapter 5. Their lives were full of hypocrisy. That's what we've seen so far in Matthew chapter 6. In chapter 5, Jesus challenged the crowd on the mountain, have a higher standard for righteousness than that of the Pharisees, this right standing before God and right living before others. In Matthew chapter 6, their acts of righteousness were done for others to see. So there's been this constant compare and contrast since the beginning of the sermon. Then in chapter 6, verse 19, Jesus said, do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and vermin destroy and where thieves break in and steal. If Jesus told the crowd not to store up treasures on earth, what do you think religious leaders must have been doing? Then in verse 22 and 23, the eye is the lamp of the body. If your eyes are healthy, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eyes are unhealthy, your whole body will be full of darkness. Then the light within you is darkness. How great is that darkness? Based on the theme and the path of Jesus' sermon so far, how would we describe the eyes of religious leaders? Unhealthy or healthy? Verse 24 says, no one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. Based on the sermon up to this point, how would we describe the loyalty and the service of religious leaders? Author John MacArthur describes the Pharisees and the teachers of the law this way. He says, they were totally consumed with things. Among all the other problems of the Pharisees, this was also to be included. They were thing-oriented. They were greedy. They were covetous. They were manipulative. They moved toward grasping more things. Now, money is a familiar topic. We find it here in our study in Matthew chapter 6, but it's found throughout the Bible. In fact, money and material things found in more than 2,000 verses throughout the Old and New Testament of the Bible. For instance, in the Gospels, Jesus talked about money 109 times in the Gospel of Matthew. In Mark, he talked about it 57 times. In Luke, Jesus talked about money 94 times. And in the Gospel of John, Jesus talked about it 88 times. Jesus told a total of about 40 parables. 1 out of every 4 talks about money, mentions money. In Matthew chapter 6, verses 19 through 21, Jesus talked about money, but there is an even bigger context. He continued to address some serious issues concerning religious leaders. They didn't understand the Word of God. That's one of the strong messages of chapter 5. They didn't understand serving the Lord, those acts of righteousness mentioned in chapter 6. They didn't have a proper view of money and material things, is what we see here in verses 19 through 24. Now, the Bible describes hypocritical religion typically in two ways: greed and immorality. We think about Pharisees and the teachers of the law back in the New Testament. There's a big question of whether Jesus cleansed that temple once or twice, because it's found at the beginning of John's gospel and at the end of Jesus' ministry in the other gospels. So there's really interesting study about when you try to put the chronological order together of Jesus' ministry. Did he do this once or twice? That's not an easy question. It's not an easy discussion. But as we read stories about that temple area, whichever one you choose, sounds like there was a lot of rattling of the coins. Money changers were likely using a dishonest exchange rate. Those selling animals for sacrifice were likely padding their pockets as well. The whole system was corrupt. Otherwise, why would Jesus have called it a den of robbers? That's why he overturned the tables and ran them out. As we move through this teaching in Matthew chapter 6, I want us to carefully remember this key verse. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Jesus is concerned about our hearts. The temptation may be greed. It may be immorality. It may be personal, or it may deal with relationships. But Jesus is concerned that our hearts remain pure. That's the message in the Beatitudes. He doesn't want to see our hearts corrupted by things of the world. Sadly, in this case, in this story, he was having to address the topic with this crowd, realizing that religious leaders had only been feeding the problem rather than teaching truth. Now, next week, we will look at the outline of Matthew chapter 6, verses 19 through 24. I will tell you this: Jesus offers two choices 3 different times. What is our choice when it comes to treasures? What is our choice when it comes to vision? And what is our choice when it comes to masters? 2 choices: treasures on earth or treasures in heaven. 2 choices when it comes to vision: darkness or light. And 2 choices when it comes to masters: we either serve mammon or we serve God. I look forward to unpacking that idea even more next Lord's Day. But as we prepare to close this time together tonight, I want to leave us with this passage. It's Proverbs chapter 30, verses 7 through 9. It's there that the wise man writes, "2 things I ask of you, Lord. Do not refuse me before I die. Keep falsehood and lies far from me. Give me neither poverty nor riches, but give me only my daily bread. Otherwise I may have too much and disown you and say, 'Who is the Lord?' Or I may become poor and steal, and so dishonor the name of my God." There was once a rich man who was very, very miserable. He had all he could buy. But there was nothing that seemed to please him, and he didn't know why. One day he visited an old friend and explained this misery to him. The old friend smiled and said, "Fred, I know what your problem is. I can show you what is wrong." And with that, he took his friend Fred over to a window and he asked him what he saw. The man stood there for a while and said, "Well, I see several men and women out on the sidewalk. I see a few children." The friend then took him by the hand and led him across the room to a mirror. "Now, look into the mirror and tell me what you see." The man said, "Well, obviously I see myself." "That's interesting. In the window, there is glass, and in the mirror, there is glass. But when you look out the window, you see the world, and you see others, and you see people, you see needs and opportunities, and things that can be done for good. But when you look in the mirror, all you see is yourself." Do you know what the difference is between those two kinds of glass? Do you know the difference? If we took a pane of glass and mounted it on the wall, would we see our reflection like it was a mirror? No, not with an ordinary pane of glass. So what's the difference between glass in a window and a glass in a mirror? That's right. The back of the mirror is lined in silver. The back of the mirror is lined in silver. And this friend told the miserable friend Fred, he said, "No sooner is silver added than you cease to see others and only yourself." You see, silver and gold, money and things that can have that kind of effect on us. It changes what we see. It changes how we see others. So our goal tonight is to take this passage, Matthew chapter 6, verses 19 through 24, begin to let it sink in. And we'll come back next week, Lord willing, and we'll continue to unpack this by looking at it through the course of the outline and just walking our way through this particular passage as we look to see what Jesus says about storing up treasures on earth versus storing up treasures in heaven.